So be patient. There we go. There are 15 parks. And my job essentially has been up to 10 years now to research these pieces of land that our parks are on, trying to trace the history of the land really from indigenous times up through the present. So you can see some of them are very large pieces of land. And of course, it's not about land, it's about people. So who are the people who have interacted with the land, lived on the land, owned the land at one time? But what I found is one of the themes I found in doing that is that we often are looking at how land use changes over time. When you're ever, any piece of land you're studying, we have these phases of the land changing itself, but also the ways in which people use the land are changed. So tonight, I decided to take three of our golf courses because I think those are interesting ways to look at how does something end up a golf course? It wasn't born a golf course. How did the land change over time? So tonight, I am going to talk about golf courses. I'm going to also talk about a dead cow, a mastodon, and 31 blue racer snakes, because each of our golf courses I'm going to talk about has one of those stories connected to it. So really, we're going to talk about history of some of our golf courses. We have five. I'm going to concentrate tonight on three of them. So let me start by taking you to White Lake Oaks and introducing you to Elmer. Elmer, as you can see, is a mastodon. And at one time, Elmer lived in the area that became White Lakes Golf Course and White Lakes Oaks County Park. Like lots of mastodons, Elmer was known for wandering through areas in edges of lakes, in wetland areas, where he liked to munch on the small trees that were there and wetland plants. And one day he was doing that, but got himself stuck in the mud. And sadly, he sank deeper and deeper and ended up stuck there. And poor Elmer died there while he was out trying to find breakfast. Now, over time, Elmer, of course, his leftovers, remains were still there. Now, I'm not going to tell you how we found out that he was near our golf course. I will come back to that in a minute. But the question is, all right, the area looks somewhat like this now. It was the glaciers were receding, but were there people there at the same time as Elmer? And yes, there were. There were people that we label as Paleo Indians, nomadic people who were hunters and gatherers who existed at the same time as Elmer would have been in that area. But the question is, were there any in that area of where our park would develop? You'll notice here these people were hunting with spears. Bow and arrows weren't being used yet. And you'll notice that they left behind these stone projectile points that look like this. And it just turns out that about 1 mile south of our park, there's been a fragment of one of those, a fluted point dated about 10,000 years old. You can see that it was broken off. It was located on the old Corpac farm. And here you can see that flute is the area where the spear point actually fit into. So not only do we have evidence of Elmer's existence, but also of Paleo Indians in that area. But then the land itself will change and the way people use the land will change. Glaciers have retreated. We got new things to hunt and gather. And so we're going to see new kinds of technology like this copper point. Copper point that, of course, wouldn't have been made in Oakland County, probably somewhere on the shores of Lake Superior, but showing that people then were in trading networks. The copper point was found about a half mile from our park on the shores of Pontiac Lake. And then yet another change into the woodland period, where we'll begin to see the beginnings of farming. Now, with farming will come the need for villages, where you have more permanent villages where you can plant and harvest crops. Here's where our park developed, White Lake Township, and you'll notice right here, evidence of two villages within White Lake Township. So we clearly, in what is now a golf course, we clearly have history that goes back for a very, very long time. But we know things will change again, and there'll be additional changes. And this area, sitting in 1815 in Michigan, will be surveyed. The land will be divided up into townships, and then the townships will divide it up into mile by a mile sections. And what purpose for that? So that the land can be put up for sale. And now we'll see a change in people in the area and land use. Now, in White Lake Township, here our park will develop in what was the edge of Section 24, and it will be right here that in 1836, William Reed and his family will come and purchase the land that will become our park and golf course. So he's the first person to actually purchase the land from the federal government. He will come with his wife, Susanna, from New York, like so many people did. He also came with 9 children, and right after they got to White Lake Township, baby James was born. So, as similar to lots of early families, a large family living in a small place, living in a log cabin at that time. This is not the Reed cabin. This is another early cabin. This is one of the few pictures we have from White Lake Township of a cabin that did exist within White Lake Township. It's just that it's not the Reed cabin, but it gives you a good idea of what log cabins look like from that time period. And then in 1852, the Reeds will sell their land to someone named Friend Webster. Friend Webster, another person from New York, he was interested in education, and he will build on his land a school, which is now just on the edge of our park. I'll show you in a photo a little bit later, but he'll build a school there. Here's a picture of the school. If you know Greek Revival architecture, classic turnbacks for Greek Revival School. It will start in the 1850s, and it will actually be used until 1926, when at that time it will be replaced by a little brick building just to the west. Here's what's cool. We have an inside photo from the White Lake Historical Society of the school. You know, we have very few of these. We have a lot of photos of the outside of these schools, but a lot of them were so modified that a picture of it now, where it's been modified into a house, is fairly useless. But it gives you a great idea of what the Webster School looked like. Now, Mr. Webster will decide that maybe farming wasn't for him. So by 1863, he will sell his farm and move into Pontiac, where he will run the National Hotel in Pontiac for quite some years. Now, he will sell the land, however, to the Van Tyne family. Jacob Van Tyne will come to the area with his family, but Jacob Van Tyne will sadly pass away just 3 years later, actually about 2.5 after he buys the land. And he will leave the land to his wife, Loretta, and his son, Albert Van Tyne. Now, here was the problem. He left them the land, but he also left them a tax bill. Now, a tax bill you have to remember that land was taxed in those days. And it doesn't seem like much to us now, but the equivalent was about $562. And that was a big chunk of money for Loretta Van Tyne to try and get together. But according to the family history, she was able to do that and keep the farm afloat. When you look at historical records, you'll see that more than one farmer lost their land because they got behind in taxes during this time period. So she managed to pay the taxes, and she and Albert continued to run their farm. Eventually, Albert would take over that farm. He and his wife, Sarah Van Tyne, you see this wonderful picture of them. Again, the White Lake Township Historical Society has this beautiful picture. Here's another picture that's hugely important. This is the Van Tine farmstead. You'll see the house there. That house now was sitting where our parking lot at the golf course at the park is, right in our parking lot. You'll see the barn, which was to the west, and then just beyond the barn, it's not in this picture, was the Webster School. So this gives us a glimpse into the past where now we have the golf club and a golf course. Here's what the actual farm looked like. And then the land, as it often does, will pass down into the family, and Elmer Van Tine will inherit the land. Now, he, however, was more interested in business than he was farming. He was one of the founders of the Detroit Business Institute, very much interested in business. So he had a different kind of plan for his farm. In the area was a small lake called Lime Lake. Really, it really wouldn't even qualify as more than a pond. But he had a plan. He got some partners together, some investors, and they began to buy up the farms around Little Lime Lake. And then they put a dam here on the Huron River in order to create a much larger lake that happened to be a lake they called Lake Pontiac. Today, of course, it's reversed. We call it Pontiac Lake. It's a huge lake, and a lot of people don't know that that lake is a human-made lake that began as this tiny little pond. Well, now, why were they doing that? Well, why Oakland County was growing in terms of recreation. People now interested in fishing and boating and having a cottage, being able to rent a cottage or own a cottage on a big lake. So that was their plan. They wanted to create more water space in Oakland County where they could have cottages that they could rent and cottages they could sell. Here's a wonderful picture. This is 1925. This is Elmer Van Tine's farm. And then 1927, that's his farm. People are essentially swimming in his cornfield. This is after the flooding of the lake was done. But again, think about that changing land use over time. Now we're wanting, people want recreation. Then he decided, okay, I have this cool lake. We got some cottages there. People are coming out to fish. Wait a minute. Maybe they'd like to come for golfing. And that was when he turned the rest of his farm into a golf course, which he named Twin Lakes Golf Course. Now, in 1971, he put that land up for sale, still in the Van Tine family, and we would purchase the golf course. So here was a case where we bought land that was already a golf course. We didn't develop one. So in this case, we bought that land and then began to run it as a county golf course in 1971. Now here's our aerial photo. Here is where the school was located. Here's our main, you'll see to the right of it, our main parking lot. And right there was where the Van Tine farmstead was. So imagine now you've got all of this history packed into this cool little area. But wait a minute. I promised I'd tell you how we know that Elmer was there. Well, it turns out that about 3 years before we purchased the golf course, out 1968 along M59, not far, about less than a half a mile from where our park is, people discovered bones, and they turned out to be mastodon bones. There was excavation done there. The bones eventually were reconstructed. You'll notice that not all Elmer was there, but a good part of him reconstructed, and he went to then to live at Oakland Community College Highland Lakes campus in a building there. Now, you know that that campus is being sold, but I've been assured that Elmer is safe and they are looking to find a place where Elmer can safely go when that campus is sold. But wait a minute, how did he get the name Elmer? You know, I admit he kind of looks like an Elmer, but how did the name come? Well, it turns out that he was named by some of the students who were involved in the excavation. And what had happened when they removed the bones from the ground, initially they wanted to coat the bones so that they could be boxed and sent out to the college. And they coated the bones with Elmer's glue. Hence the name Elmer, which would stick down through time. He does have a more formal name, but we will all know him as Elmer. Now let me take you to Lion Oaks, way down in the southwest of Oakland County. And again, history is going to start with Indigenous history. Doesn't matter where you are in the county, that's going to be where human history begins. Right up here, this is Lyon Township. Our park is in the far northeast corner. And right here, this is the Grand River Trail, very significant Native American trail that began in the Detroit area and literally stretched all the way across the state. And crisscrossing it was the Pontiac Trail, another significant indigenous trail. Now, here's my theory. If you have two major trails that are crossing your land, I think you're going to have indigenous history. And we're certainly learning that that was the case. But we also had villages nearby. Up here and here in Lyon and in the edge of Milford Township, we have evidence of two significant villages. So once again, our history starts with indigenous history. But then same story will happen. People will come out and purchase that land. Here's our parkland. This a map from the 1850s, but people will be there way before the 1850s. Right here is the Grand River Road. It utilized a lot of what had been the Grand River Trail, just like Woodward Avenue and Dixie Highway utilized the Saginaw Trail. So our parkland developed just on the edge of the Grand River Road. But there would also be in this area not just farms, but a little town named Hickville. I had not heard of Hickville till I researched this park. Now, what was the story of Hickville? Well, Hickville was named by Daniel Hickok, who named it after himself, who had started a post office in the area, got the federal government to give him a post office because he said he was starting a little town, and then in the 1840s, he built a hotel there at Hickville. Now look at that building. That's a pretty substantial hotel. Why would Little Hickville, which essentially was just the hotel and the post office, why would you need that size of building? Well, it turns out that by that time, the Grand River Road had turned into a stagecoach route. It was running stages from Detroit and Lansing Stage Company. And so that hotel, let me go back. That hotel you just saw was a stagecoach stop. And it would be so for many, many years. So our park does have stagecoach history connected with it. By the 1870s, of course, stagecoaches were over, and then we'd have now the growing farm history of the area, beginning actually in the 1840s with a person named J. Marlott. He would buy several pieces of land in Lyon Township. He shows up on the 1870 census. Always think you got to have people research, you got to look at a census. Here he was, and notice this is 1870. The value of his farm in Lyon Township was $25,000. That's one of the biggest values I've located in Oakland County in the 1870s, particularly in that area. That was a very valuable farm. Now, he was living in his household. He had a housekeeper, Sarah Baker, and her two children. Sadly, Sarah's husband was a Civil War soldier. He'd been killed during the Civil War. And in order to survive after the Civil War, she became the housekeeper for J. Marlott. But it turned out in 1875, Jay married Sarah and married his housekeeper. And according to a wonderful historical record I found, Quote, she rescued him from the horrors of bachelorhood, unquote. So yes, Sarah rescued him. They had quite an extensive farm. They actually had two different houses. This is one of the farmsteads that he had. This is one of the few farms that show up from Lyon Township in the 1877 Oakland County history. Right next door was Spencer Renwick and his farm. Spencer Renwick was connected to J. Marlott. In 1863, he had actually married J. Marlott's sister, Mary. This is another common pattern you're going to see in Oakland County. Farms very close to each other, sometimes right next door, that are connected by marriage. A common pattern connecting the Spencer and the Marlott families. Now, it turns out that Spencer Renwick has a claim to fame. He was vice president of the AHTA. I had to look that up. Think for a minute. What would AHTA stand for? Look what you see here. A horseshoe? Somebody on horseback? This was a national association, and Michigan had some chapters of the American Horse Thief Association. And no, this was not an association of horse thieves. It was quite the opposite. This was kind of a vigilante group that were out and about trying to catch horse thieves in their area. Horse thievery was a big problem in Oakland County. Horses were very valuable, and there are many a newspaper article that talks about horse thieves in an area. Well, how'd the process work? Well, after a horse went missing, the owner notified local riders of these groups, and then the roads were watched, and they began to put out circulars on the horse thief they were after. And then, when thieves were spotted, the riders chased them down, hunted them down, chased them, hunted them down, and turned them over to the sheriff of Oakland County. So this was a new something for me. I didn't know we had a chapter of the AHTA. And I certainly didn't know that Spencer Renwick, who owned land that became our park, was a very valuable leader in that group. And then up here was the farm of John Lake. Has actually had purchased it with his brother. I found John Lake in the 1870 census. He was here as a farmer and with his wife Frances and two children and a farm laborer who was working for him. And now I had a problem. I had found this really cool story about Jay Marlott, about him marrying his housekeeper and she saving him from bachelorhood, and his farm, how big it was, and the picture was in the 1877 history. And then Spencer Renwick, who was working to catch horse thieves. I had to find something really cool and interesting about John Lake, but I was having trouble finding anything. It seemed like he was just kind of an average farmer on a kind of smallish farm. But then in the Milford Times in June of 1900, I found John Lake's claim to fame because it turned out that on that day, a cow belonging to J.M. Lake was killed by lightning during Wednesday's storm. And that was a big enough deal to make the paper when his cow was struck by lightning in a field and killed. Now, when I went on to read the article, wasn't a terrible tragedy for John Lake because he had cow insurance. I was not aware of the fact that farmers actually carried livestock insurance. Livestock was valuable. Some farmers insured their cows before they insured their house. So it was this article that was John Lake's claim to fame, but helped me understand something important about agriculture. Livestock was hugely important. Their cows, their horses. Lightning was a big problem. lightning resulted in fire. And so we had these incidences where people actually insured their livestock because they were so valuable. They developed terrible fears of lightning. You'll see in a minute there'd be an invention that would help deal with that fear. But I wanted some more proof about lightning. So I went to the digital Michigan newspapers. It's right online. It's a treasure trove of old newspapers. And I did a search. I took just newspapers from Oakland County and only the years 1880 to 1889, less than a decade. And I located almost 1,200 newspaper articles about lightning. That tells you the fear that lightning caused, how people were talking about the fires caused by lightning, lightning rods, as you'll see, someone who was peddling lightning rods. And again, you think I am trying to find the history of a golf course. But that's what's so cool about local history. Suddenly, I'm finding about something that was feared by farmers, something that caused them to buy insurance, something that led to all these newspaper articles. Well, in 1992, we will begin to purchase the land, the parcels, 10 of them, that will create Lion Oaks County Park. And of course, one of them will be John Lake's farm. And here was something interesting. I would learn many years later that when the crew came to work on that farm, our parks crew early on, there was a small shed left behind that had been owned by John Lake. And when they opened that shed, it was filled with lightning rods. Now think about John Lake's past. Now, initially, the crew said, why would a farmer have so many lightning rods? And it would remain a park mystery for many, many years. But then, after I became park historian, we had at Lion Oaks, we had an all-staff meeting, and I was given 20 minutes to tell the story of Lion Oaks County Park, the history. Well, I had to tell the John Lake Farm story and his dead cow story. And at the back of the room, suddenly a guy stood up and said, "Yes, you solved the mystery." And I said, "What mystery?" He said, "About the lightning rods we found." So it took us almost over 20 years to solve the mystery of those lightning rods, but it turned out that they had to do with John Lake's dead cow. So here's a picture of our golf course. Now this is different. Remember with White Lake Oaks, we bought a golf course. In this one, we developed the golf course. So a little different story. This is one that we created. And finally, I'm going to take you to Glen Oaks County Park. We are now celebrating the 100th anniversary of that golf course. We, of course, haven't owned it for 100 years, but it has 100 years of history. Here's a good picture of the golf course. It's a very well-known one, a very popular golf course. And not just for the course, but before for the incredible clubhouse that's connected with the golf course. And it has an interesting history. Of course, we have indigenous history there. This piece of land resides between two trails that are moving north-south in that area. But I don't have time to tell too much more history, but we do know what will happen next. This is Farmington Township. Right here in section 2 is where our park will eventually develop and the golf course. And in 1830, Daniel Benjamin and his son James will be the first people to purchase the land that will become our park many years later. The Benjamin family will own that land up until the early 1900s. Now, let me give you an idea of where we're at. Here's Orchard Lake Road, and here's 13 miles. So we're north of Farmington. We're actually in Farmington Hills. Now, I like to look at the agricultural census. You know, we have them for 1850, 60, 70, and 80. I always like to know, especially when I know now it's a golf course, What was the farm like at the time? So I looked up James Benjamin, who now had inherited the farm. He actually will live on that farm for over 50 years. But I noticed that according to the agricultural census, he had 3 horses, 12 cows, 5 pigs, 60 chickens, and 150 sheep. Pattern in Oakland County. Particularly at that time, 1850 to 1900, we were predominantly raising sheep as livestock. He was growing corn and oats and wheat at the time. I noticed he also had just 1 acre of potatoes and 5 acres of apple trees. Here's why I like to look at the agricultural census. When I see a picture like this of people who are golfing at Glen Oaks, I imagine sheep grazing right next to them on a golf course. You know, if you're a golfer, when you're out at one of our golf courses, you can be assured that at one time there was probably cows or sheep grazing on that golf course. Well, by 1908, the Benjamin family was still in the family, owned now by Milton Benjamin, who was the youngest son of James Benjamin. Now, here's another farm that's going to become a very important part of our story. It's the farm of Isaac Bond. It was literally right across Orchard Lake from the Benjamin farm. Here's a nice picture of the Isaac Bond farm in 1915. You know, there's nothing like a picture, a photo to show you when you're thinking about an old farm. That was the magic of the Van Tyne picture. Now we have the Isaac Bond farm. I found this one, but I found an even cooler one. Look at these old trucks. They're lined up. They are picking something up at Isaac Bond's farm. They were picking up seed potatoes. It turns out that Isaac Bond had developed a very special seed potato, and it was well known in Oakland County, and farmers would take their trucks out to pick up seed potatoes from him. But it turned out like Isaac Bond had something similar to Elmer Van Tyne. He really decided that farming wasn't quite for him. He was more interested in business. So he got some people together, primarily from Detroit investors, and they formed the Great Lakes Land Corporation. Their purpose was to develop a subdivision. This was a time in Oakland County history where we saw another main change in terms of the uses of land, and that was creating subdivisions. Now, why was that happening at this time period? Well, here's a good reason. Cars. Cars were now more affordable. More people, families could own a car. Now, what did this mean? You no longer had to live very close to where you worked, close to the factory you worked in, close to your workplace. So that was changing. This photo, by the way, is Orchard Lake Road and Pontiac Trail. If you're familiar with the bend there, what a great photo. And this, of course, is just to the south, just to the north of our park. Not only that, but this piece of land that they were developing was also connected to an electric trolley system. By that time, the Detroit United Railway had run an electric train out to Pontiac and then down Orchard Lake Road and then back to Detroit, which meant they could tell people if you move into our subdivision, you can work in Pontiac, you can work in Detroit and take an electric railway home. So that was an added incentive. You had space out there where you could now have fresh air, not live in a crowded city, and you had easy transportation to get there. So they would turn Isaac Bond's farm into a subdivision. They would plat the land. You can see platting just means they're going to create roads. They would purchase land on the other side of Orchard Lake. And then they would also begin to develop a golf course on the old Benjamin farm. And keep in mind, right here, the Detroit United Railway ran right into that area. They called their area the Oaklands. It was decidedly new and distinctly different. There were a lot of subdivisions going in, a lot of them out Woodward Avenue. Many of them had literally not much more than a city lot and a kind of a cookie cutter house. They wanted something different. You'll notice, like most subdivisions in these areas at the time, it was restricted. I think we all know what that meant. This wasn't a welcoming spot, and even a spot where some folks weren't allowed to live at that time. There were restrictive covenants on some of these lands, kind of a sadder part of our history. So this was a restricted area. And of course, they were advertising that the adjoining golf club would be there. Now, why did they mean it was going to be different? Well, here was the Isaac Bond farm. His house and barn was still there. But notice here, these were the lots they were developing. These were way bigger than most subdivision lots. They were the equivalent of 6 large traditional lots, and they were called small estates. So this was their way to entice people. This is going to be a different area. They even had photos like this in their advertising. These lots are so big, your children can bring their pony with them. Your children can have a cart pulled by goats, and there's enough space to keep the goats and the cart in your area. And the housing will not be cookie cutter. It'll be distinctly unique. They planned on having maybe only 8 to 10 models of houses, but very different than what was being built in other subdivisions. They hired the architectural firm of Butterfield and Butterfield to design those houses. That consisted of Wells Butterfield and his daughter, Emily Butterfield. They'd been designing a lot of churches together. This is the Methodist Church in Farmington. They were members of the church later and also designed it. They had studied architecture in Europe, and so you see European influences in the churches they were designing. They were also part of the movement that was saying a church shouldn't be just a small building. It should have spots in there where people can come together and utilize the building more. They had designed some apartment buildings in Detroit, also the Highland Park School, again echoing their architectural design. Now, Emily was cool. Emily wanted to be an architect like her father, couldn't find a place around here to study. So in 1904, she went to Syracuse. It was one of the few universities that had an architectural program that allowed women. She'd come back to Michigan, and in 1907, she became the first woman to be a licensed architect in Michigan. And it would be Emily who would design the houses at the Oaklands. Here's one of the first ones. She decided to start with one, and she called this one the house with the ocean wave roof. And you can see that there. It's arts and crafts style, if you're familiar with architecture. It still exists. You can still see that beautiful roof is there. Here's another. This was one of her favorites. She called it the Cotswold Cottage. It's been wonderfully kept up and restored by a family. Here's a picture of the inside of it. Here's another one on Ardmore. Here's what it looks like today. You'll notice, let me go back here. Notice on the right, that kind of solarium room, a greenhouse room. That today is a garage, but you can see Emily's architecture still there. Take a look at this one. What does this remind you of? Could it be a barn? Well, it probably was, because records indicate that Emily Butterfield took this barn, the Isaac Bond barn, had it moved across the field, and then actually used that to create this very distinctive house. Whose decision? Was it Isaac Bond who wanted to hold on to his barn? Was it Emily? We don't know, but it does seem that that was the case. And then, of course, the development of the golf course, the Glen Oaks Golf Course, just to the east of it. That was designed by William Robertson. William Robertson was from Scotland. And like most people from Scotland, he was a golfer, but he was a watchmaker initially. He came to New York and decided to give up watchmaking and to become a pro golfer. But then, as he played on different courses, he kept suggesting improvements. Well, maybe you should try this as you extend your golf course, and became then a significant golf course architect. One of the other courses he would develop, which I just learned today, believe it or not, I didn't know he had developed. I stumbled upon this fact today that he developed Twin Lakes Golf Course, the one that Elmer Van Tyne had developed, which is a cool connection between two of our golf courses and two of our parks. Now, William Robertson left behind some ideas about how challenging Glen Oaks Golf Course was. He found the area where he wanted to put the first fairway was a deep ravine. And he said, this is cool. This will be a challenging hole. But as he went out with a crew, began to construct that first fairway, they were met by 31, not 30, not 29, but he says 31 blue racer snakes in that ravine. And so he kept talking about the challenges of that golf course. Well, he said, now we have to have a clubhouse. Initially, they used the Benjamin House, the old homestead. Unfortunately, I cannot find a picture of it. But then it was decided, wait a minute, we got this classy golf course. We need a good building, a good golf club. And that's when, in August of 1928, they will begin the groundbreaking for a new golf club. It'll be designed by Arthur L. Weeks, who was well known in Canada. He has less designs here. This is probably one of his most significant, but many buildings in Ottawa, Canada were designed by him, and then he will come to Detroit area. You can see it here under construction. Beautiful, beautiful building. He used the similar to the Butterfield's architecture, which is why for a long time, and that's a story I'll have to tell next year. But the Butterfield, particularly Emily, was attributed as having designed this building, but it wasn't. It was Arthur Weeks. But you see the heavy stone, the turrets, the slate roof. And then it all fell apart. The depression will occur and everything will literally just stop. The houses that are built will just literally be by themselves in fields. No more houses will be built. It won't be until the 1950s into the 60s that we'll begin to see housing now developed in that area. But the golf club kept going.
Have your attention, please. Library closed in 15 minutes. All public computers shut down at that time. Thank you.
That was just our library warning. The golf club made it through the Depression and in those difficult years of the 1930s. It changed owners multiple times, but they kept coming up with things that would keep it going. They knew golf was going to be limited, so they tried to find other ways to get them into the golf club. For example, they kept publicizing that it was where the fun begins. They opened it up for dances and banquets, chicken dinners, all kinds of things. They even declared that if you wanted your marriage to last forever, all you needed to do was have your wedding reception at the panoramic room of Glen Oaks Golf Club. They tried one thing after another, but it worked. The golf club kept afloat. In fact, in 1952, they even had to add on a banquet hall, a kitchen, and golf locker rooms. Well, by 1974, the golf club will be sold. It'll be sold to the Detroit Shriners Club, who intended to build a Muslim temple there, an additional temple there, and also a possibility of a building, a structure where people could retire there. That didn't work out for them. So by 1978, they had put it up for sale, and we would buy that. And Oakland County Parks would now take over that piece of land with so much history. We will keep the name Glen Oaks, call it a county park. And of course, now we maintain that beautiful historic building. We will even have to add on to it. It's a very popular building and golf course. We put on in 1990s another large banquet room at the end. You'll see it here. It's a beautifully designed building. They wanted to echo what Weeks was trying to do with the exterior of the building and some of the interior. So you can see again the large vaulted roofs that Weeks had planned for in his initial design of the other part. And of course, we still have our very popular golf course. So like the other two golf courses, this is a story of land use changing over time, different people coming on to land. And of course, it's three cool stories. One about a mastodon, one about 31 blue racer snakes, and one about a dead cow. And I'll end there. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. We have a few minutes for questions if you have it. You've got my email is there. We won't be joining together for a fireside chat till September. I'll be back then with some brand new stories. And if you have something you're interested in, I guarantee you I can find a park connection because we've got parks spread all over the county. But if there's a facet of Oakland County history that you'd be interested in, send me an email and give me a suggestion. I'd love to work on that over the summer. How about questions or comments? A lot of history there. Rich Stamps.
Well, I like the presentation tonight. I especially liked the way that you were able to give the time depth to the indigenous populations. You know, it's very popular now to recognize the Anishinaabe and the more recent tribal groups, if you will. But it was good the way you were able to take it all the way back to the indigenous folks, and I appreciated that. That was very good. And it was just fun to see the transition through time of their park. So keep up the good work.
That's right. 10,000 years in about 50 minutes. Not bad. Other questions or comments? Anybody else?
Hi, Carol, it's Crystal.
Hi, Crystal. You got a question?
Yes, when you were talking about the first portion of the presentation, the Van Tyne family, they're attributed with the creation of Lake Pontiac. I find that interesting because one would think that the land would be more valuable because of the opportunity to tax land rather than tax a lake. What are your thoughts on that?
I think what it had to do with was just major changes in Oakland County. We were becoming recreation destination. By the 1920s, people were coming from Detroit out to Oakland County for boating, and I think that's what they realized, that even though land is taxed, farming was not as viable anymore. We were heading into the land of families whose kids didn't want to farm. Elmer was a perfect example. I don't really want to be a farmer. I want to go into business, and comes up with this plan. It's kind of odd because Oakland County, we had 430 lakes. So you wonder, people still were creating new ones. Dixie Lake, which is out on along Dixie Highway, another human-made lake. Just shows you how the economic activities were changing, focus in Oakland County was changing, and people decided, there's money in water over land now. Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Monica. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Monica.
Hi, I have three quick questions, if I could.
Sure.
The Horse Thieves organization, the forget the acronym. Do you know when that disbanded? Because it's so
No,
interesting, because you mentioned how valuable horses were back then, and now in today's time, they're not even really respected anymore. So I was just curious when they disbanded.
That's a really good question. It will start in the 1850s, early on. And the Oakland County one, and they're not over Oakland County. One of the biggest ones was right down there in southwest Oakland in Lyon, which tells me that might have been where the biggest issue was. I would suspect part of it had to do with changes in law enforcement in the county, where you just
Um,
had the growth of law enforcement. And then also, I'm going to look that up for you because I'm curious how long that group was what was used, because essentially you can see where these vigilante groups could cause issues too. I'm sure as the sheriff and deputies and the enforcement got more extensive, these people might have gone astray sometimes also. So I think it's a combination of factors. But that's an interesting point. These groups that happen, how long do they stay? And now we know horses are still very important and valuable in Oakland County, but it's real different, isn't it? It's horse farms and equestrian events. Our parks, Rose Oaks, has wonderful equestrian facilities out there. So now it's a different way we're viewing horses, valued in a different way. But that's a great question.
okay, thank you. And then in one of the ads for the new subdivision, the picture with I think it was the kids in the wagon. There was
Yes.
a mailbox there by the road. I thought that was interesting because I guess I didn't picture that mail delivery was in such a rural area like that.
Exactly. And that's another interesting thing. When the rural free delivery is started, it will happen in different spots. What tells you that is that Farmington was growing, and you know what happened? People like Isaac Bond were pushing to get a rural route. They were saying, okay, we're developing a subdivision. We need to tell people they're going to get mail delivery here. So all of these things are factors that are happening at similar times. The transportation comes out. People are moving in. They don't want to go into the little post office was a little tiny one in North Farmington, or when that stopped, Farmington itself. So all those factors were impacting history at that time.
Okay. And then on the last one, you had mentioned when those houses were developed and then the Great Depression hit, they stood empty. So they were completed homes, but I know they weren't real close to the cities, but nobody was able to live in them.
Actually, they were lived in. All of the six the ones you saw were owned initially by the officers of the Great Lakes Land Corporation. President, vice president, treasurer, they all lived in them for a while. And then some of them lost their own homes. And then over time, which was kind of cool, except for two of them, they weren't knocked down. They were held on to, and the cookie cutter subdivision got built right around it. You got to drive
Uh,
out there. It's interesting to see.
yeah, I was just there last night in
Oh,
that area.
okay. Cool.
Orchard Lake and 13. So those were my questions, and I could listen to you all day. You
Oh,
have such
thank you.
a clear and exciting and the visuals way of presenting things, and it makes it so easy to help me remember it as
Oh,
well. So
thank
thank
you.
you
I
so much.
appreciate that. I appreciate that. Did you hear that, Donna? Is Donna still here? No, I'm teasing because, oh, there she is. My supervisor's here. Did
Oh,
you hear that, Donna? Did you hear that? I'm just teasing Donna. Thank you, especially to those of you who hung out with me since September for these. I appreciate that. We are coming back with some great news stories in September and lots going on this summer. Pontoon boats, rides out at Independence Oaks. We'll be doing those. I'll teach history on a pontoon boat. If you haven't joined me on one of those, make sure you come and join me. You can email me for information and I'll get you the registration information. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Carol.
Thanks, Anna.